Warriors of the Infinite, welcome to Chapter 15 of REN-SHEN Half Spirit, Black Spice. The seaplane landed in the ocean adjacent to the Xiamen foreshore. Steve had woken from his morphine-induced sleep. His senses were still dulled from the tablets. He tried his best to elevate himself from his hazy stupor, but it was impossible. He observed Hiro gesticulating and instructing a couple of Chinese men in suits. Steve couldn't understand a word. Hiro returned to Steve. "I must not know where these men will take you. If Kumicho finds me, he will force me to tell him, and I will not be able to resist. I have paid these men to hide you somewhere. You must recover. Take this money. It's all I could gather quickly. When you're better, find your way back to Australia. Do not come back to Japan. You surprised Kumicho this time. If he has another chance with you, no evil will be spared to destroy you." Steve mustered all of his energy to find a shard of his voice momentarily and raspily whispered, "My child, I need to find my baby." Hiro grabbed Steve's shoulders and looked him in the eyes in a pleading yet resolute manner. "I've never seen anyone fight Kumicho and live. Maybe you truly are Ishiganto. Whoever, whatever you are in no condition to care for your baby or face Kumicho. Let the gods choose your baby's destiny for now. I left him with good people. I already told your people to move your child. I must not know where either of you are. He will not remain in Japan. Find him when you are stronger. You have $10,000. It will keep you going for a while. Thank you again. For as long as I am myself, I am indebted to you." Steve's depleted physical condition limited his ability to communicate meaningfully with Hiro. The best Steve could do was blink at Hiro and duck his head slightly. The gestures seemed enough for Hiro. He had found his absolution. He ran with renewed energy to the two Chinese men and barked out some instructions and handed them an envelope. The tablets had lost their effectiveness and Steve's pain had returned in full. He was consumed by the searing pain in his chest while noticing some small red-eyed demons latched on at the feet of Hiro as he ran into some back streets and out of view. Steve witnessed the complete transformation of Hiro from demon to human. To further compound Steve's monumental grief and physical pain, it occurred to him that his sensei Mike did not have to die by his very own hands. Steve could have saved him if he only knew more about himself. "I failed, every single one of them," he cried as he buried his face in his hands. Hiro was right about the Chinese men. They were businesslike in their manner. They were filthy with yellow and red-eyed demons. Yet they dutifully attended to their task for Hiro and barely engaged with Steve in the process. They kept off the main roads as much as possible and drove for about an hour. They finally stopped in front of an historic building that looked untouched for the last 200 years. It looked completely out of place among the industrial buildings in the precinct. The driver said something unintelligible to the associate and left the car. The associate gave up playing with the car radio and turned around to acknowledge Steve for the first time. He smiled at Steve and said, "Crocodile Dundee, good, very good," and gestured with his thumb up. Steve took a moment to register what he was saying. Then he realized he was trying to say Crocodile Dundee, the famous Australian movie from a few years earlier. The corners of Steve's mouth turned upwards into something resembling a smile, and he managed to turn his thumb upwards. The driver returned to the car with a woman walking in front of him. She was a small, old woman wearing too much makeup. Her dyed black hair abruptly changed into white at the crown of her head, and her dress was flimsy and unfortunate in what it revealed of her body. She peered inside the tinted windows of the car and saw Steve slumped in the back seat. She hissed her instructions and the men assisted Steve inside the establishment. The building looked as though it was ready for demolition on the outside, but inside it was opulent and had the elegance of a much earlier era, with ornate rosewood furniture, sumptuous cushions and exquisite drapes adorning the walls. It was smoke-filled and dimly lit with coloured lamps. There were multiple small rooms on either side of the passageway. Partially clothed women and boisterous drunk men were cavorting in and out of the rooms. It quickly occurred to Steve he was being ushered into a brothel. Demons were clinging to everyone. Small, slithery creatures with fangs freely moving and hissing over the people inside. Even in Steve's diminished condition, he noticed the serpentine leeches had differing characteristics. Some were greyish, others were black. Their slits for eyes were different colours. Blue-eyed demons attached to the patrons and the whores, with their yellow and occasional blue-eyed ones. All were repulsive and reminded him of Kumichal's lobby when the sword pierced his heart and the room changed into a filthy black pit of serpents. The old woman was walking in front and directing the men who were assisting Steve. Her eyes were darting around the establishment in a way which made it clear she was the boss. She whispered curses at the whores as they passed her and smiled insincerely at the drunken patrons. They neared the end of the passageway and turned left into a small storeroom. A little girl was sitting on a pile of boxes next to the rear wall, which was adorned with a luxurious drape. No more than 8 years old, she was playing with her doll contentedly and seemed oblivious to all the goings-on in the rest of the establishment. Steve noticed immediately that the girl was unblemished, completely devoid of demons. He'd almost become desensitized to seeing them, but it was jarring to see someone without the demonic affliction. The old woman, bathed in a sea of yellow-eyed demons and a few red-eyed demons, noticed Steve looking at the little girl. She shook her head and scowled at Steve. Steve gathered the old hag assumed he wanted the girl for sex, but didn't have the energy or inclination to explain himself. The little girl bounced off the boxes and quickly moved them out of the way. The old woman reached behind a nearby cupboard and pulled a lever. The drape dragged across the rear wall, revealing a concealed door which opened automatically to expose a hidden room. The hag motioned for the men to take Steve across the threshold into the hidden area. Thin, semi-opaque curtains delineated the confined space, and Steve was placed on a low bed furthest from the secret door. "Crocodile Dundee," laughed the men as they both left him on the dirty bed and closed the door behind them. The only light source in the room came from a small clock radio next to his bed. Steve clutched at his painful chest while the muffled sounds of laughing and shouting continued on the other side of the hidden door. Old Chinese opera songs were playing on the clock radio. The faint orange glow radiating from where the blade pierced him reminded him of his cursed life as he drifted into a fitful sleep. The door opened and the bright daylight from the adjoining room's window streamed into Steve's hidden chamber. He tried to sit up, but tensing his abdomen muscles seemed to amplify the unbearable pain in his chest. He couldn't move. The hag dragged her slippers across the tiled floor and entered Steve's area. The same yellow-eyed demons dominated her person. She was asking Steve some questions in Chinese. He couldn't understand a word. He tried to respond, but his throat was too dry and he was too weak to gesture with his hands. She left him some water and a small portion of rice with a few vegetables. Steve tried to get up, but it was futile. The clock was showing midday when the hag closed the door behind her. Steve couldn't reach the food or water and gave up trying. He fell asleep and woke up to hear the muffled laughing, moaning, shouting and screaming from the other side of the door. The clock radio showed 11 p.m. and the faint glow emanating from his chest persisted, as did his intolerable and incessant pain. It was just after 2 a.m. when the muffled sounds sharpened. The door had been opened and some of the lamplights from the adjoining room filtered through into Steve's area. There was a silhouette of a small person in the doorway. The silhouette moved closer and drew Steve's curtain open. Unblemished, Steve thought to himself, feeling oddly relieved as the little girl walked into Steve's area and stood in front of him. She noticed his food and water was untouched and pointed at them while looking at Steve. Steve was not hungry, but he was parched. His blink seemed to work. She brought the glass of water to his mouth and he managed to drink some water. She brought the plate of food to him, but he moved his head enough to indicate he didn't want it. As quickly as she entered the room, she left, and the muffled sounds from the adjacent rooms continued to compete with the incessant Chinese operas from the clock radio next to him. It was midday when the door opened again. The daylight pierced the misery of his darkness as the sound of slippers dragging across the floor approached him. Steve saw the yellow-eyed demons long before he even acknowledged they were attached to the hag. She had brought more food and water and noticed the food from the day before was untouched. She hissed at Steve while replacing the food and drink. She closed the door behind her and Steve was left alone in the darkness to dwell in his pain. It was near 1 a.m. when the door opened and the noises from the adjacent rooms became clearer. He opened his eyes and was relieved to see no demons on the silhouette in the doorway. Still unable to find the strength to serve himself, he was hopeful the little girl might give him some water. She pointed to the water and said, "Huh," making a drinking gesture. Steve noted and learnt the word for water or drink as she helped him rehydrate. She tried to offer food to Steve, but he was still unable to even contemplate the thought of eating. She remonstrated with him as though she was telling off her doll. She sat with Steve for a while and pointed around the room, identifying everything in Chinese. She pointed to herself and said, "None." Steve's pain never left him, but he was grateful for the break to his wicked nightmares. He pointed to himself and said, "Steve." Nan smiled, then concentrated intensely as she carefully pronounced his name as Shidifu. She heard someone shouting her name in the next room and quickly left, looking disappointed to leave the foreigner in the hidden space. The faint glow from Steve's chest had faded even further, but the pain continued to radiate from the same place and was his constant reminder of the immense losses in his life, his beautiful wife, the one to whom he gave himself so completely, gone in an instant. He remembered their first chance meeting, that faraway wave she gave him as she headed to her train in Shibuya, her sign and motivation for him to chase her to the end of the world. Memories of their quietest moments with no need to talk or even look at each other, and the feeling of how complete they both felt just by being in each other's company. He could still see her beautiful smile, that one especially reserved for him, her impossible beauty and the way her smile played with her teeth, her mesmerizingly beautiful and expressive eyes, the way they conveyed every emotion without saying a word, the way she blossomed during their time together, her face of confidence she presented to the world when he first met her versus the woman she had become after receiving Steve's avalanche of love. She'd found herself through Steve's unconditional love and told him so every day. He had been reborn through her love. He was happy, not happy the way a child would be with a new toy, but happy in a way that allowed him to find peace. Happy in a way that enabled him to appreciate little things, which he didn't even notice or care about before her presence enriched his life. He could feel her in bed with him there and then. He wanted to turn and see her, but his pain was his only real companion in his bed. If only she could touch him again, it would surely cure him from the relentless pain. She couldn't. She was dead, and Steve's punishment for letting it happen was to live. The Chinese opera streaming from the clock radio seemed to lament his loss. Dreams and reality merged into each other as his gloomy confinement played a wicked game with his sanity. By the time it was midday, he wasn't sure if he had slept at all. The door opened and the light seemed to bounce off the yellow-eyed demons as the hag dragged her feet on the ground towards Steve. She had no interest in the foreigner hidden in her establishment. She performed her necessary tasks in relation to food, water and lodgings and quickly left Steve to his solitude. On one occasion, Steve heard a siren and a muffled stampede somewhere in the establishment. Then the door opened and in hurried all the women working there. They were scantily clad and wearing too much makeup. Worried about being found, they remained exceptionally quiet. They had not seen Steve before and quite possibly had not seen many foreigners in their lives. It was strangely surreal as they gravitated to his dimly lit area and peered and pointed at him as though he was a circus animal. It was the first time Steve noticed the blood on his clothing, the same clothing he wore that horrific night only days earlier. The door opened and the hag shouted at the women as they promptly scuttled out. Nan would often sneak in to talk with Steve. By the end of the week, he could recognize some often used Chinese words. He was grateful for her visits. Her unblemished spirit reminded him of when he couldn't see the world's evil as plain as daylight. She momentarily distracted him from his pain and, more importantly, from his vicious cycle of dark thoughts. The mental torture of his painful solitude was chiseling away at whatever was left of his former identity. By the end of the week, the hag dragged her slippers in along with an extra bite to her typical nasty demeanour. She engaged with Steve more directly than ever before. A few hand gestures were enough to convey her message, rubbing her fingers against her thumb, then waving her hand and finally pointing to the door. Whatever money had been given for food and bed for Steve was finished. Steve knew he was physically in no position to move. He had tried the day before and remained unable to pick himself up from his bed. He remembered the money Hiro gave him and reached into his jacket and pulled out a substantial wad of cash. The frenzied, yellow-eyed demons were teeming all over the hag as her demeanour instantly changed. The insincere smile, usually reserved for paying patrons, was served up to Steve in all its unimpressive theatre. She pounced upon the money and took what she deemed was appropriate. No doubt more than what the Chinese men paid her the week earlier. Steve's condition was such that she could have taken all the money. But perhaps she would have to answer to those Chinese men. In any case, she found new motivation to care for the sick foreigner in her midst. He remained weak and was still barely able to move in his second week there. However, his moaning during waking hours had stopped. The hag seized upon his subtle improvement and let her greed for money be her only guide. As a retailer would seek to sell extras to a customer, the hag offered each of her harlots to Steve. Much to her disappointment, he rejected all her offers. He was disgusted at the thought and in any case was not in a position to even move, much less participate in coitus. His level of disgust reached new levels when the hag threw Nan into his room. She had noticed how Nan would talk with Steve and try to teach him Chinese. She offered the little girl to him and gestured she would cost big money if he wanted his way with her. Steve's depleted physicality had zero correlation with the rage he felt internally. How could that evil witch offer the little girl to him? He thought to himself. He closed his eyes and turned his head away from the disgusting hag. His mind returned to his newborn son, the thought of someone else looking after him, making decisions on his behalf, motherless, and for all intents and purposes fatherless. His son would not know how loved he is, nor how his father rejected the tranquility of death to come back for him. Steve's agenda was clear. He needed to find his strength and then find his son. The stabbing ache in his chest persisted and he could no longer discern between his physical pain and the ache for his parentless son. The hag returned the following day. She brought with her a new strategy. She unveiled a small lacquered box, an ornate bamboo and silver pipe, a lamp and various knives and scissors. She pointed towards Steve's chest and proffered a thumb up and said, "Doctor." Steve assumed the hag had brought a traditional Chinese medicine solution to help him with his pain. He was longing to find his baby son. He needed his strength and he was eager for a remedy. His instincts shouted him to avoid anything offered by the hag, but his son was out in the world somewhere and he needed his father to be strong enough to find him. Steve accepted her offer immediately and had no conception of the hell he was about to descend into. The hag was delighted as she attended to his medicine. She opened the lacquered box and extracted a small brownish coloured substance. She trimmed the wick of her lamp and lit the flame. She proceeded to work the substance with the heat of the flame until it became almost caramel coloured. She worked the substance until she was happy with the texture and shape, and then finally transferred it to the porcelain bowl of the ornate pipe. She instructed Steve to smoke the pipe as she lined up the resin to the lamp flame. The medicine bubbled and released its vapour. Steve drew the smoke into his lungs with immediate effect. His coughing heralded a reaction he wasn't prepared for. The heaviness inside his chest lifted in a euphoric way. The pungent and powerful smell from that resin sent Steve into a blurred state of serene reality. The hag looked in Steve's eyes for his approval, while Steve consumed the last of the godly medicine. Steve watched her demons fade as he nodded his head and continued with his pipe dream. The hag scraped the residue from the bowl and closed the door behind her. His medicine was fully consumed, but the effects were enduring. His mind was free and he was transported. Recollections of the celestial landscape he fleetingly experienced with Temyana, his misery, pain, and dysfunction were replaced with a deep sense of calm. He was a bird, flying above the senselessness of it all, wordless, mindful, and contemplative. He saw it all and understood. He noticed Nan came into the room but paid her no attention. He was on a different path and needed nobody. He didn't see the disappointment on Nan's face, nor did he care, as his waking euphoric dreams settled him into a transcendental journey, and ultimately, the deepest of sleeps. He woke in a pool of his own sweat with a stabbing pain in his chest and stomach. He was convinced Kumacha was there and twisting the blade with all his evil intent. The pain was so intense he screamed. The door opened and the daylight streamed into his area. The hag quickly rushed inside and Nan quickly followed behind her. The hag brought Steve's medicine and commenced preparing his dose. Nan was normally extremely compliant with the hag, but she argued with her and pointed at the medicine. Her reward was a slap in the face as Nan held her face and looked at Steve, shaking her head in a combination of disappointment and disapproval. She left the room as the hag pointed to where Steve kept the remainder of his money. Steve nodded immediately. He was in too much pain to reach for the money, so the hag helped herself. She peeled off a few $100 notes and then helped position Steve so he could take his dose. The pain disappeared and Steve was on his celestial journey as soon as his lungs embraced the vapour from that bubbling ambrosial resin. The hag's demons disappeared and her smile looked almost sincere and benevolent as she quickly stuffed the money into her bra and left Steve in his secluded sanctuary. Steve finished the remainder of his medicine, the vapour nectar, and found himself alone on a great desert plain. He could feel the presence of someone or something nearby, but no matter where he turned, he couldn't see anything. He heard a baby crying in the distance, beyond a desert dune. He ran towards the direction of the cries, but the baby eluded him. It seemed always beyond the next dune. The disappointment of not finding the baby after so many attempts soon eroded his serene state. His feelings of deep tranquility were quickly replaced with a sense of increasing urgency. Is the crying baby mine? How would he recognize it if it was? Why was it crying? Where is Megumi? Where am I? Who am I? What am I? Questions seemed to cascade into each other as Steve tried to make some sense out of his pipe-induced excursion. A sandstorm was building around him as the baby's cries faded into a furious vortex of wind and sand. The cascading questions, unanswerable, and the relentless wind and sand lashing his face reinforced Steve's feelings of hopelessness. He was beaten down into the desert sand repeatedly, nearing surrender. A whisper inside him became a shudder, and then it transformed into an intense oscillation, shaking his entire body into a kind of mystical divination. He roared and released his lion energy into the violent vortex. His majestic and gigantic bright orange lion fiercely quelled the maddening maelstrom, then turned and looked at Steve. Hours passed as the lion and Steve silently inspected each other. Finally, Steve reached forward and touched the orange embodiment of his rage, only to see the lion completely disintegrate. It fell apart and was replaced by an army of men. They were warriors, powerful men of differing size and shape, and wearing clothing of different eras, some wearing knight's armour, others in ancient Roman style, and others in nondescript peasant's garb, poised and primed for war. They were all strangely familiar. Perhaps it was their eyes or the angle of their cheekbones. He intuitively sensed they were all of his bloodline. Steve saw the infinite stories on their sombre and purposeful faces. Among the horde, one face seemed most familiar. Steve moved closer to inspect the face of the fierce, yet familiar warrior. The man was looking straight through Steve, without giving him the slightest acknowledgement. Steve spent an inordinate amount of time examining the man before him until a spark of a memory sent him reeling. He fell to his knees in front of his father, sobbing uncontrollably. By the time he looked up to his father, the horde of his bloodline had disappeared, and Steve was forsaken again, lost in his dreams. Weeks had passed as Steve descended further into his medicated hell. One time when the police arrived to inspect the premises, one of the prostitutes hiding in his den used the English word for Steve's medication. She was pointing at the pitiful man before her and talking about him to her co-worker. He learned his medication was nothing more than opium. He had a name for what he already knew. The black spice had reduced him to nothing more than a junkie. In the same way the British colonial empire subdued the Chinese masses well over a century earlier, he was confined to his miserly bed and lost in his wicked dreams. His only source of comfort was his next inhalation of the dragon's breath. It stung him with its venom and burned its mark on his soul. His body was barely functional and his mind was distracted with those wickedly euphoric dragon dreams. The cold sweats, stomach-wrenching pain, diarrhea, and anxiety were his cue for calling for his opium confidant. His mother witch, that wretched witch of a woman, had become the most important person in his life, his sustenance, his life, his purpose. All-powerful, she controlled his happiness as she metered his rationed resin. His money was about to run out and he knew it would only be a matter of time before the hag would cast him out of his sanctuary. He would beg her. He wasn't ready for the world. Any time he found joy in his life, it would be cruelly crushed and the people he loved would die. His megumi was gone and the numbing effect of the black spice was his only relief. But one momentary splinter of a vision, a barely discernible question, soon became so recurring and haunting that he was forced to assess the part of himself he had been hiding from. He had succumbed to addiction and his question screamed for an answer. What if Kumacho offered me an endless supply of opium? Would I serve him? He asked himself. He knew he could never compromise himself for that wicked monster, and yet he had done the same thing for the pathetic, money-hungry hag. Ready or not, even at his lowest point, his free will rejected the thought of obeisance to Kumacho, and he rejected the temptation of the black spice. He stood on his feet and noticed his emaciated body for the first time as an incredible cacophony of commotion started outside his room. He heard the hag screaming and men shouting, breaking glass and furniture smashing, and the sound of bodies thudding continued until his door finally opened. The silhouette of a small, unblemished human stood in the doorway. Steve whispered, "Nan, Guole, come here." But a little old man laughed as he stepped into Steve's dimly lit den of despair. He held out his hand and said, "Guole." Steve followed without question. Steve left the room, his safety and his jail after approximately 40 days. Led by the little old man, he crossed the threshold into the room next door to see Nan sitting on a box. She was playing with a doll as Steve tried to catch her attention, but she refused to look at him. Steve felt the greatest of shame. He was not the good man he once was. He'd succumbed to the temptations of the wicked vapor and hid from his fears and questions. He looked down at his feet, immersed in his guilt, when he noticed the filthy demons with different coloured eyes vying for supremacy. The old man seemed to see what Steve saw and laughed as he led Steve outside. Everyone in the establishment quickly and fearfully moved out of his way. The brothel was a mess. It looked like an explosion had been set off in the corridor. The hag approached Steve with her telltale hand gestures, clearly looking for the last of his money. The old man did nothing more than take a mild interest in her as she cowered and feigned a fragment of modesty. She waved Steve forward as though she was wishing him well. Warriors of the infinite. I think we reached our darkest point, have we? What a terrible time for our hero. Clearly in pain. A lot of issues to think about over 40 days and nights. He was in extreme pain. The solution was simple. The medicine. What medicine was it? The black spice. Opium. Never a good solution, my dear friends. Never a good solution. He was forced to go inside himself for a moment. In a brothel of all places, he could see the demons. Ever since that sword pierced him, he could see everything. Not a problem. He could see the motivation. Different coloured eyes of those demons suggested different things. Greed, anger, lust. You'd have a bit of all those sorts of things around a place like that. There was one person, unblemished, Nan, beautiful little Nan, yet to she was certainly exposed to all the horrors of life from such an early age, but yet to fully understand them, and kept her innocence. Steve could look at her and not see any demons on her, unblemished, lovely. She took an interest in Steve, but when he took an interest in the black spice, in the opium, he lost interest in her. And in a sense, he became a little bit tainted, didn't he? You know, how could you be on your own path there? And it was a path of depravity, addiction, drugs, terrible. So he descended into his own hell. He was having those dreams, the one dream where he could hear a baby crying. Perhaps it was his son. But released the lion, and all of a sudden it broke down. It was his whole bloodline, every person in line. Imagine that. Imagine you're looking at someone from your bloodline from 1,000 years earlier. And he's looking at them all, and he can see something familiar about every single one of them. Gets his father. Was his father judging him? His father didn't even acknowledge him, looked straight through him. Steve fell on his knees crying. Had he earned the right to be standing with those men? Was he good enough? Will he measure up to those men, all of those warriors, all of his bloodline? Will he ever measure up? And maybe that's the recurring message there. Is he good enough? Is he good enough? Is he part of that line? Is that line part of him? Is it there in the best possible way? There's a question mark, obviously, because he's a junkie now, addicted to opium. Interesting discussion about opium. I thought it's nice to bring that up in line with China. China will probably be offended for good reason, for a very good reason. You must understand, China culturally was just so advanced. It didn't want to trade with anybody. Over 150 years ago, 200 years ago, it didn't want to trade with anyone. It actually said, you know what, we do everything for ourselves. We don't need anybody. They need us. And everyone was trying to trade with the Chinese. The Dutch were desperate to get in there. I think eventually they found a way. Funnily enough, and we know our connection through Okinawa, the Ryukyu people were close enough to China to actually have trade with the Chinese. So a lot of people ended up trading through Okinawa, through that region, and getting their product into China. So this is a couple of hundred years ago. China didn't even want it, but they did it. They managed to make some money out of the Chinese, and eventually opened up small avenues of trade. Well, the most wicked avenue of trade was in fact opium. And if you follow a bit of history and read up on it, you'll be absolutely astounded to realise that one of the largest employers in Hong Kong right now, aside from government, is a company called Jardine Matheson, whose original shareholders were effectively two of the biggest drug dealers in history, dealing in opium. So it's just amazing. And effectively, they managed to make almost all of China, certainly their armies and navies, addicted to opium. So weakened the entire nation terribly. they were literally begging for mercy at one stage and handed Hong Kong to them for a 99-year lease. So you should look at the establishment of Hong Kong and its relationship with opium, if you like an interesting read one day. Amazing, really. Getting back to the story. So, Steve was really in a very bad way and questioning things, and he then reached a point where he thought about it. He was really addicted. He wanted to get product. He would have taken it from anyone, but would he? He had a clarity of a moment. He had the clarity to be able to think, what if Kumachul was going to give him an endless supply, his father-in-law? An endless supply of opium, the black spice. That's what he loved. He craved it. He chose not to. In a moment of free will, he rejected it. And all of a sudden, that noise outside, a little figure appeared in the doorway, a silhouette of a human. Was it a human? He thought it was Nan. He said, "Come here, gole, gole," in Chinese. It was an old man, unblemished. How many people are unblemished once they get to a certain age? Only Nan at 8 years of age told Steve to come with him. Steve got up and just went. Maybe it was because he was unblemished. Maybe there was another reason. We don't really know. I don't think Steve knew. I think some part of him knew there was no choice. And he walked past Nan, and Nan didn't even acknowledge him. It's terrible. I think that was the point. At that point there, Steve realised that he wasn't as good as he thought he was. He'd already compromised himself. And Nan made it very clear that she was not interested in a person like that. So perhaps that was fueling a bit of guilt in Steve. So we're well and truly past 3/4 of the book now, my friends. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is a very dark chapter. I needed it in the book. The dominant purpose was Steve had to make a choice. He needed to make a choice on his own free will. This is a choice where, effectively, it's a choice of good over evil. And he had time to think about that and immerse himself in some of the complications, and we're all doing that on a daily basis. We make decisions. Some of them not so good. We'd like to think there's a scale that measures up and perhaps good outweighs evil in our lives. And some very, truly, deeply evil people would do the same thing and say, well, I'm doing it for the greater good, so not a problem. So we've got to live with our own conscience, I guess, over time. So interesting. I hope you enjoyed that. We've got a few more chapters to go and it gets pretty crazy coming up, so enjoy it. I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. So thanks for sticking with me. I know there was a little bit of a gap before this one came out, but we will see you shortly. Thank you again. See you soon.